Everyone knows about Elisa Lam. Almost nobody knows about the 14 other people who died in the same building, or that a structural flaw might explain all of it. I need you to hold that thought. Not the name. Not the viral elevator footage. Not the Netflix documentary or the Reddit threads or the thousands of amateur investigators who picked apart a young woman's final moments. Forget all of that for a moment. Because the thing that should terrify you about the Cecil Hotel has almost nothing to do with Elisa Lam. It has to do with a pattern. A pattern that stretches back nearly a century. A pattern that clusters in specific rooms, on specific floors, in a building that has been quietly killing people since 1927. And it has to do with a discovery made in 2021 by a structural engineer whose findings were buried in a municipal report that almost nobody has read. 14 deaths. At least 14. Some were obvious: violence, addiction, the grim arithmetic of a building that warehoused the desperate and the forgotten. But others were not obvious at all. Others were strange. Circumstances that didn't add up. Behaviors that seemed irrational until you consider one very specific, very physical, very measurable possibility. This is not a ghost story. This is not a paranormal investigation. What this is, and I need you to understand this clearly, is far worse than any ghost story could ever be. Because ghosts aren't real. But carbon monoxide is. Let me take you back. The Cecil Hotel opened on December 20, 1927, at 640 South Main Street in downtown Los Angeles. It was built to be beautiful. 700 rooms across 15 floors, an ornate lobby with marble floors and stained glass, designed by the architectural firm Loy Lester Smith. The idea was to create an upscale destination hotel for businessmen and tourists visiting a city that was, at the time, exploding with promise. Los Angeles in the late 20s was golden. The movies were there. The money was there. The future was there. But the Cecil had a problem from the start. Its location. Main Street in downtown LA sat at the edge of what was already becoming Skid Row, and by the time the Great Depression hit just 2 years after the hotel opened its doors, the neighborhood around it had collapsed. The clientele changed. The businessmen stopped coming. The tourists found other places. What filled those 700 rooms instead were transients, drifters, addicts, sex workers, and people running from things they could never outrun. The Cecil became a residential hotel, a single-room occupancy building where you could rent a room by the week or the month, no questions asked. And it was in this transformation, this slow decay from grandeur to desperation, that the deaths began. The first recorded death at the Cecil Hotel was in 1931. A guest named Percy Ormond Cook was found dead in his room. The cause was listed as suicide by poison. He had checked in 3 days earlier. No one knew him. No one came to claim the body. You might think that a single suicide in a transient hotel during the Depression is unremarkable. And you'd be right. Except that Percy Cook was not the last. He wasn't even close to the last. Between 1931 and 1962, the Cecil Hotel recorded at least 7 deaths by defenestration. Let me say that again. 7 people went through windows at the Cecil Hotel over a 30-year span. 7. Now, the word defenestration has a clinical sound to it, almost academic, like something you'd encounter in a history textbook about Prague. But strip away the Latin and what you have is this: a human body falling from a window and striking the ground below. And what I need you to understand is that falling from a hotel window is not a common way to die. Not even in transient hotels. Not even in buildings full of people suffering from addiction and mental illness. The national average for deaths by falling from buildings in the mid-20th century was extraordinarily low. For a single building to record 7 such deaths in 30 years is, by any statistical measure, an anomaly. Let me walk you through a few of them. In 1937, a man named Louis D. Borden was found on the sidewalk outside the Cecil. He had fallen, or jumped, from a window on the 4th floor. The coroner's report noted no signs of struggle, no evidence of intoxication. The window in his room was found open. His belongings were neatly arranged. There was no note. In 1938, a Marine sergeant named Roy Thompson fell from the top floor. Again, no note. No clear motive. The room was undisturbed. In 1939, a woman named Erla Louise Boughton was found dead outside the hotel. She had fallen from a window on the 4th floor. She was 25 years old. She had checked in the previous day. No note. No history of mental illness that anyone could find. In 1944, Dorothy Jean Purcell, a 19-year-old woman who had been living at the Cecil for several weeks, threw her newborn baby from a window. She later told police that she didn't know she was pregnant and thought the baby was already dead. She was acquitted by reason of insanity. In 1947, Robert Smith jumped, or fell, from one of the upper floors. In 1954, Helen Gurney leapt from a 7th-floor window and landed on the Cecil's marquee. In 1962, Pauline Otten fell from a 9th-floor window and landed on a pedestrian named George Giannini, killing them both. 2 deaths from a single window. 7 defenestrations. 1 building. And here is the detail that matters most, the detail that got buried under the sensationalism and the ghost stories and the true crime podcasts. At least 3 of these deaths occurred in rooms on the 4th floor. At least 2 more occurred in rooms on floors directly above the 4th floor, rooms that shared the same vertical infrastructure, the same walls, the same pipes, the same ventilation shafts. Hold that thought. We're going to come back to it. Between the 1960s and the 1980s, the Cecil Hotel continued its descent. The neighborhood around it became one of the most dangerous in Los Angeles. Skid Row solidified into what it remains today, a concentrated zone of homelessness, addiction, and systemic neglect. The Cecil was right there on its border, absorbing everything the city refused to deal with. And the deaths continued. In 1964, a retired telephone operator named Goldie Osgood, known to the other residents as Pigeon Goldie because she fed the birds in a nearby park, was found dead in her room at the Cecil. She had been stabbed, beaten, and sexually assaulted. The room was ransacked. Her murder was never solved. Think about that for a moment. A woman was brutally murdered inside this hotel, and no one was ever held accountable. Her case file still sits in the LAPD's cold case archives. No witnesses. No suspects. No justice. Just a room at the Cecil Hotel and a body that nobody could explain. In the 1980s, 2 serial killers were linked to the Cecil. Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker, lived at the Cecil in 1985 during his murder spree across Los Angeles. He paid $14 a night for a room on the top floor. He would come home from his killings, walk through the lobby in blood-stained clothing, and take the elevator up to his room. Nobody stopped him. Nobody reported anything unusual. Later, Jack Unterweger, an Austrian serial killer who strangled 3 sex workers in Los Angeles in 1991, also stayed at the Cecil during his crimes. 2 serial killers. The same hotel. Within 6 years of each other. And still, the deaths that interest me most are not the murders. They're not the famous cases. They're the quiet ones. The ones that got a paragraph in the LA Times and then vanished. The unexplained suicides. The bodies found in rooms with no sign of struggle, no note, no clear reason. The people who checked in seeming fine and were found dead days or weeks later. Because those deaths, the quiet, inexplicable ones, are the ones that cluster. And now I need to tell you about the floors. When you look at the Cecil Hotel's death records in aggregate, and very few people have done this, because it requires pulling coroner's reports, police records, newspaper archives, and cross-referencing them with hotel registration logs, a pattern emerges. The deaths do not distribute evenly across the building's 15 floors. They cluster. Specifically, they cluster on the 4th floor and the 14th floor. Now, the 14th floor is interesting for a reason that most people don't know. Many tall buildings built in the 1920s and 1930s skip the 13th floor in their numbering. It's a superstition, triskaidekaphobia, and the Cecil followed this convention. So what's labeled as the 14th floor is actually the 13th floor. That's a well-known architectural quirk, and it's easy to dismiss it as a coincidence. But the 4th floor has no such numerical trick. It's the actual 4th floor. And it is, structurally, one of the most important floors in the building. Here's why. In 2021, as the Cecil Hotel was undergoing renovation, it had been purchased by a developer named Richard Bourne, who planned to convert it into a mixed-use affordable housing complex. A structural engineering survey was conducted. This survey was required by the city as part of the permitting process. The engineering firm, and I want to be precise here, because precision matters, conducted a full assessment of the building's mechanical systems, including its HVAC infrastructure, its plumbing, and its ventilation. What they found was this: the Cecil Hotel was built with a coal-fired furnace system in its basement. This system heated the building through a network of ducts and ventilation shafts that ran vertically through the structure. The main trunk lines of this system, the primary shafts, connected the basement to the 4th floor and then continued upward to the 14th floor before branching to the upper stories. The coal furnace had been converted to natural gas at some point in the mid-20th century, the exact date is unclear, but likely in the 1950s or 1960s. However, the conversion was not complete. The original ductwork was left in place. The original ventilation shafts were never sealed, never updated, never brought up to code. And here is where it gets very, very dark. The engineering report noted evidence of significant corrosion in the gas lines connected to the converted furnace system. It noted gaps in the ductwork. It noted that the ventilation shafts connecting the basement to the 4th and 14th floors showed signs of long-term exposure to combustion byproducts. Combustion byproducts. That is the clinical term. The common term is carbon monoxide. Carbon monoxide is colorless. It is odorless. It is tasteless. You cannot see it, smell it, or taste it. It is, in every meaningful sense, invisible. And it kills in a way that mimics other things, things that are easier to explain, easier to dismiss, easier to file away as just another sad story from a sad building. Let me tell you what carbon monoxide does to the human brain. At low concentrations, levels that might not trip a modern detector, levels that would build up slowly over hours or days in a poorly ventilated room, carbon monoxide causes headaches, dizziness, confusion, and nausea. These symptoms are easily mistaken for illness, intoxication, or withdrawal. At moderate concentrations, it causes impaired judgment, disorientation, visual disturbances, and hallucinations. Auditory hallucinations. The feeling of being watched. The feeling that someone else is in the room. Paranoia. Irrational fear. The sense that something is deeply, fundamentally wrong, but the inability to identify what. At higher concentrations, it causes loss of motor control, seizures, unconsciousness, and death. But the death is quiet. The body simply stops functioning. The heart slows. The breathing becomes shallow. And then it stops. Now, think about what I just described. Think about a person in a room at the Cecil Hotel, a transient, someone with no family checking on them, someone who might not be missed for days, slowly being poisoned by an invisible gas leaking through century-old ventilation shafts from a corroded furnace system in the basement. Think about that person becoming confused, disoriented, paranoid. Think about them experiencing hallucinations. Think about them opening a window because they feel like they can't breathe, because the room feels wrong, because something is pressing in on them from every direction. Think about them standing at that window. 3 of the defenestration victims at the Cecil were found in rooms on the 4th floor. The 4th floor, where the main ventilation trunk line from the basement terminated. The floor with the most direct connection to whatever was coming up through those shafts. And here is another detail that I have not seen discussed anywhere, not in the Netflix documentary, not in the Reddit threads, not in any of the dozens of YouTube videos about this building. The rooms on the 4th floor of the Cecil Hotel did not have individual ventilation controls. The heating system was centralized. Air moved through the shafts based on convection, hot air rising from the basement, pulling whatever was in the basement air up with it. In the winter months, when the furnace was running at full capacity, the concentration of combustion byproducts in those rooms would have been at its highest. Now look at the dates of the defenestration deaths. Lewis Borden, 1937, early spring, when the furnace would still have been running. Erla Bowden, 1939, the same. The clustering of deaths in the colder months is not absolute, but the trend is there. More deaths when the furnace was active. Fewer when it was not. This is not proof. I want to be clear about that. This is not a smoking gun. The furnace was converted decades ago, the engineering report was conducted decades after most of these deaths, and there is no way to go back in time and measure the carbon monoxide levels in room 417 on the night Lewis Borden went through the window. What this is a hypothesis. But it is a hypothesis that fits the data better than any other explanation I have seen offered for why one building in Los Angeles produced so many unexplained deaths over so many decades. Let me tell you 5 things about the Cecil Hotel deaths that nobody has been able to satisfactorily explain. 1. The clustering on specific floors. If the deaths were simply a function of the hotel's desperate clientele, suicides driven by addiction, poverty, mental illness, you would expect them to distribute more or less randomly across all 15 floors. They don't. 2. The behavioral patterns. Multiple witnesses over the decades described residents on the 4th and 14th floors exhibiting symptoms consistent with carbon monoxide exposure, confusion, paranoia, complaints of headaches and nausea, reports of feeling watched or followed, visual and auditory disturbances. These reports were attributed to mental illness or drug use. They may not have been. 3. The window pattern. The defenestration specifically cluster in rooms with windows that open onto the building's light wells, vertical shafts between the hotel's wings that would have created a chimney effect, pulling air upward from the lower floors. This is exactly the kind of structural feature that would amplify the dispersal of basement origin gases. 4. The lack of notes. In the general population, approximately 40% of suicide victims leave some form of note or communication. At the Cecil Hotel, the rate was dramatically lower. Among the defenestration deaths, none left notes. This is consistent with carbon monoxide-induced behavioral change, which impairs executive function, the ability to plan, to communicate, to think abstractly. A person poisoned by carbon monoxide might act impulsively, desperately, without the cognitive capacity to write a note, because the part of their brain responsible for that kind of organized thought is already shutting down. 5. The Elisa Lam footage. I said I wasn't going to talk about Elisa Lam, but I need to address this, because the elevator footage is the most widely analyzed piece of evidence from the Cecil Hotel, and almost every analysis I have seen misses the most important thing about it. Watch the footage again. Not the way you watched it before, looking for ghosts or invisible attackers or signs of foul play. Watch it the way a toxicologist would watch it. Watch her motor function. Watch how she moves her hands. The pressing of buttons seems purposeful at first, then becomes repetitive and confused. Watch how she steps in and out of the elevator, as though she can't decide, as though her decision-making capacity is compromised. Watch how she gestures at nothing, how she appears to be responding to stimuli that aren't there. These are textbook symptoms of carbon monoxide poisoning. Textbook. Elisa Lam's room was on the 14th floor. The 14th floor. The other floor where the deaths clustered. The other floor with a direct connection to the basement ventilation system. I am not saying that carbon monoxide killed Elisa Lam. The coroner ruled her death an accidental drowning in the rooftop water tank. What I am suggesting, and what I believe the evidence supports, is that carbon monoxide exposure may have contributed to the behavioral episode captured on that elevator footage. It may have contributed to the confusion, the paranoia, the apparent hallucinations that led her to the roof in the middle of the night. It may have been the invisible hand that pushed her toward a sequence of decisions that no rational, unimpaired person would make. And if that's true for Elisa Lam, then it may be true for Lewis Borden. And Erla Boughton. And Roy Thompson. And Helen Gurney. And all the others whose names you've never heard, whose deaths were filed away as suicides or accidents in a building that was slowly, invisibly poisoning the people inside it. I want to talk about what happened after the 2021 engineering report. The short answer is, almost nothing. The report was filed with the Los Angeles Department of Building and Safety as part of the renovation permit process. It noted the ventilation issues. It recommended remediation. The building was already empty, the Cecil had closed to guests in 2017, and the renovation project was underway. The furnace system was no longer operational. The immediate danger had passed. But no one connected the engineering findings to the historical death pattern. No one went back through the coroner's reports and cross-referenced them with the structural data. No one asked the question that, to me, seems blindingly obvious: could this building have been killing people for decades through a mechanism that no one thought to look for? Part of the reason no one asked is that the people who died at the Cecil Hotel were, overwhelmingly, people that society had already decided not to care about. They were transients. They were addicts. They were sex workers. They were people without families, without advocates, without anyone who would demand a deeper investigation when a coroner wrote "suicide" on a death certificate and closed the file. This is the thing about carbon monoxide that makes it not just a physical poison but a social one. It kills invisibly, and the invisibility extends beyond the gas itself to the victims. If a wealthy businessman dies in a luxury hotel under mysterious circumstances, there's an investigation. There's media coverage. There are lawyers. But if a nameless transient dies in a flophouse on the edge of Skid Row, there's a body bag and a pauper's grave and silence. The Cecil Hotel killed at least 16 people over the course of its operational history. Some of those deaths have clear explanations. Goldie Osgood was murdered, the Ramirez and Unterweger victims were murdered, Dorothy Jean Purcell's case involved a specific and documented psychotic episode. But the unexplained deaths, the quiet deaths, the falls from windows, the bodies found in rooms with no note and no apparent reason, those deaths form a pattern. And that pattern aligns with a structural flaw that was hiding in the building's bones for nearly a century. I want to address the counterarguments, because I think intellectual honesty requires it. The first counterargument is that the Cecil's clientele was inherently high risk. These were people struggling with addiction, mental illness, and extreme poverty. The baseline rate of suicide and accidental death in this population is significantly higher than in the general population. This is true. And it's possible that the clustering I've described is simply a statistical artifact, a product of small numbers and confirmation bias. But this argument doesn't explain the floor-specific clustering. If the deaths were purely a function of the clientele, you'd expect them on every floor. You wouldn't expect them to concentrate on the two floors most directly connected to the basement ventilation system. The second counterargument is that the engineering report doesn't prove that carbon monoxide was actually present in lethal or behaviorally significant concentrations at any point during the building's history. The report documents the structural conditions that could produce carbon monoxide exposure. It doesn't document actual measurements from the 1930s, 1940s, or 1950s, because no such measurements were ever taken. This is also true. And it's a significant limitation. But absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. The measurements weren't taken because no one thought to take them. No one thought to take them because the victims were invisible. The victims were invisible because they were poor. And so the circle closes. The third counterargument is the one that I find most troubling, and it's this: even if carbon monoxide was a contributing factor, it doesn't explain everything. It doesn't explain Goldie Osgood's murder. It doesn't explain why two serial killers chose to live there. It doesn't explain the Cecil's reputation as a cursed or evil place, a reputation that preceded any knowledge of the ventilation issues. And this is where I have to be honest with you. I don't think carbon monoxide explains everything. I think it explains a significant subset of the unexplained deaths. I think it explains the behavioral anomalies. I think it explains the clustering. But the Cecil Hotel was also a product of systemic failures, failures of urban planning, of social services, of law enforcement, of basic human decency. The building was a trap in every sense of the word. It trapped people physically, economically, and, if I'm right about the ventilation, chemically. The horror of the Cecil Hotel is not that it was haunted. The horror is that it was neglected. The horror is that a building with a known pattern of unexplained deaths was allowed to operate for nearly 90 years without anyone asking why. The horror is that the answer may have been in the walls the entire time, in the corroded pipes, in the unsealed ducts, in the invisible gas drifting up from the basement like a slow, patient predator. And the deepest horror of all is this: how many other buildings are doing the same thing right now? The Cecil Hotel is not unique. Single-room occupancy hotels exist in every major American city. They house the most vulnerable populations. They are often the oldest buildings in their neighborhoods, with the most outdated mechanical systems, the least maintenance, and the least oversight. The people inside them are the people least likely to have carbon monoxide detectors, least likely to recognize the symptoms, and least likely to have anyone notice if something goes wrong. Carbon monoxide detectors were not required in California hotels until 2013. The Cecil Hotel operated for 86 years before that requirement existed. 86 years of invisible gas potentially leaking through invisible pathways into rooms occupied by invisible people. I keep coming back to the rooms. The specific rooms. 4th floor. 14th floor. Rooms with windows that opened onto the light wells. Rooms connected to the main trunk line of a ventilation system designed in 1927, when building codes were suggestions and coal furnaces pumped combustion gases into the same air supply that heated the rooms above. I keep coming back to Louis Borden, standing in his room on the 4th floor in 1937, feeling something wrong. A headache that wouldn't go away. A dizziness that made the floor seem to tilt. A creeping sense of dread, formless and sourceless, building in his chest. The room pressing in on him. The walls too close. The air too thick. And the window offering air, offering relief, offering escape from something he could feel but couldn't name. I keep coming back to Erla Boughton, 25 years old, one night in the Cecil, found on the pavement below her 4th floor window. What happened in that room? What was in the air? What did she see, or think she saw, in those final confused and terrified hours? I keep coming back to Elisa Lam in the elevator, pressing buttons that don't respond, stepping in and out, her hands moving in patterns that look purposeful but aren't, her body language shifting from confusion to agitation to something that looks very much like fear of an invisible threat. An invisible threat. There is a famous case in forensic science, the case of the Tallman family in Wisconsin in 1988. The Tallmans moved into a house and almost immediately began experiencing what they believed were paranormal phenomena. Strange smells. Headaches. Nausea. The children reported seeing figures in their rooms at night. The family became convinced the house was haunted. They moved out. A subsequent investigation found dangerously high levels of carbon monoxide leaking from the home's furnace. Every single paranormal experience the family reported was consistent with carbon monoxide exposure. The Tallman case became a landmark in the skeptical investigation of haunted houses. It demonstrated that what people experience as supernatural, the feeling of a presence, the visual and auditory hallucinations, the overwhelming dread, can be produced by a measurable, physical, entirely non-supernatural cause. The Cecil Hotel has been called the most haunted hotel in America. Former residents reported feeling watched. They reported hearing voices. They reported a pervasive sense of evil, of wrongness, of something lurking just out of sight. These reports have been cited as evidence of supernatural activity by paranormal investigators and as evidence of the building's dark psychological atmosphere by skeptics. But what if they're evidence of something else entirely? What if the Cecil Hotel's reputation as a haunted building is itself a symptom, a collective, decades-long symptom of chronic, low-level carbon monoxide exposure affecting hundreds or thousands of residents who passed through those rooms and carried their experiences out into the world? What if the ghosts of the Cecil Hotel were carbon monoxide? I want to leave you with something that I found in the Los Angeles County Archives while researching this piece. It's a complaint filed in 1953 by a resident of the Cecil Hotel, a man whose name is redacted in the document. The complaint is addressed to the Los Angeles Housing Authority. It reads, in part, "The air in my room is not right. I get headaches every night. I feel like something is pressing on my chest. I asked the manager and he said there is nothing wrong. But there is something wrong. The air is wrong. I can feel it." The complaint was noted. No action was taken. The file was closed. The air is wrong. I can feel it. 68 years later, a structural engineer confirmed that the air was, in fact, wrong. That it had likely been wrong for decades. That the building's ventilation system was a delivery mechanism for an invisible poison that could cause every symptom the man described, and worse. But by then, it was too late. It had been too late for a very long time. The Cecil Hotel is currently undergoing renovation. When it reopens, it will be a different building, new systems, new infrastructure, new purpose. The ventilation shafts will be sealed or replaced. The furnace system will be modern and up to code. The invisible threat, if it existed, will be gone. But the 16 people who died there will still be dead. And most of their names will still be forgotten. And the question of what actually happened to them, what was in the air they breathed, what invisible thing drove them to windows and water tanks and quiet, unexplained deaths in rooms that no one cared about, that question will remain unanswered. Because no one thought to ask it when it mattered. And by the time someone finally did, the evidence had corroded away, just like the pipes that may have produced it. The Cecil Hotel is not a ghost story. It's a failure story. A failure of infrastructure. A failure of oversight. A failure of a city to protect its most vulnerable people from a danger that was hiding in plain sight, or rather, hiding in no sight at all, because carbon monoxide is the one killer you will never, ever see coming. And if you're watching this in a building built before 1960, in a room heated by a system you've never inspected, breathing air that moves through ducts you've never seen, I want you to sit with that thought for a moment. The air is wrong. I can feel it. 16 people died at the Cecil Hotel. Everyone talks about one of them. Almost nobody talks about the other 15. And nearly nobody talks about the possibility that a corroded furnace and a century-old ventilation system might connect them all. So I have to ask, what do you think really happened at the Cecil Hotel? Was it despair? Was it darkness? Was it the inevitable gravity of a building that attracted broken people to its broken rooms? Or was it something simpler, something invisible, something that was there the whole time, drifting up through the walls like a whisper you could feel but never hear? Leave your theory below. Because the 16 dead of the Cecil Hotel deserve at least that much, someone willing to ask the question that 86 years of silence never did.